The moment the cellar light flicks on, the silence fractures. A stack of unmarked journals topples from the shelf, their pages fluttering like startled birds across the concrete floor. His hand hovers above them, fingers grazing a brass key that trembles as if it had been waiting to be dropped. A sticky child's hand reaches without permission, then freezes when the key twitches toward the spilled ledger. Why that tremor? He lets the light settle back into its warm, yellow hum. The journals, now still, lean against the concrete wall as though waiting for their usual place. The child, heels tapping the cold tile, nudges a stray coil of twine toward the stack and then, obeying a gentle shake of a hand, turns to the narrow bench where the day's laundry soaks in a basin. Nearby, Mara slides a dishcloth over the rim of a battered kettle. The simple rhythm of wringing and folding keeps the silence steady. The key, brass warmed by whoever held it last night, lies between them like a small, familiar tool. No one hovers. No one rushes. In the corner, a low clock ticks in soft certainty. The routine heart of the day ticked on. Voices stay in the register of trust. A murmur about the repairman's visit later. Another about which shelf needs dusting. Even the cellar's smell, earthy, damp, threaded with lemon from the cloth, feels part of the quiet order. Nothing shifts beyond the routine, yet every motion keeps that protective hush intact. The clatter of plates had died down, but the kitchen still hummed. Julia stood at the sink rinsing beans, eyes glued to the drop of water tracing down the porcelain. "Mom, what happened the night the power went out in '98? She asked, voice level, the way she asks about homework. Elise froze, the dish towel twisting in her hands. The question hung there as a thin, sharp cord. "We already talked about that, Jules," Elise said, setting the towel on the counter. Her smile was too tight. Christian, leaning against the doorway with a bowl of salad, watched without moving. "Julia, you don't have to keep digging," he said. But his voice was low enough that only Elise could hear the slight edge. Elise's fingers unconsciously went to the small scar on her wrist, the one that had always been invisible until now. "It's not the night," she said, but the words fell short. "It's nothing you need to worry about." There it was again, the avoidance that had been crawling along the edge of every story for years. Julia didn't back down. Her brow lowered as she stepped closer, the moment thickening around her. "I only asked because you said you were afraid of thunder afterward," she said, voice steady. She watched Elise's eyes flick to the family photo on the mantel, the one where someone's arm was cut off by the frame. Afraid of thunder doesn't explain why Dad's journal pages are blank that week. The journal lay open on the counter, the handwriting stopping abruptly after a certain date. Elise grabbed the dish towel again, folding it tight until her knuckles whitened. "Julia," she began, but Christian cut in, stepping between them. "She's a kid. Let it drop." His tone carried the old weight of protection, submission, maybe even guilt. The silence that settled after his words felt like a door slamming. Julia exhaled and turned toward the pantry. "So, is there something in there you're not telling me because it's too dangerous?" She unlatched the door, pulling out the old metal lunchbox with faded rocket ships. Inside, beneath a stack of Polaroids, was a folded envelope with a single word in Dad's handwriting. "Remember." Julia opened it just enough to see a scrap of half-burned paper and a single line before Christian's hand landed on her wrist. "That's enough," he said, the word trembling, the hand tight. "You don't need to see that." Julia didn't pull away. She didn't look at Elise. Behind Christian, Elise's shoulders hitched, a breath leaving her in a rush that sounded like a confession. She reached out, fingers brushing Julia's arm but not moving the hand away. Christian let go, and the envelope slid into Julia's lap as she sat on the step. She unfolded the paper with shaking fingers. The line read, "We promised never to speak of the night the siren failed." The words weren't the forbidden detail itself, just proof that the silence was deliberate. Elise finally spoke, voice breaking enough to become the tension itself. "Some promises were made before you were old enough to understand." The room held in that line. Julia's eyes, wet but defiant, traveled from Christian to Elise, then to the door where afternoon light angled through the blinds. The payoff came not with an answer, but with a breath everyone shared. Julia slid the paper back into the envelope and set it beside the open journal. She didn't ask again. She didn't leave. She simply sat, shoulders tense, but no longer pretending the question didn't exist. Elise sat down opposite her, folding her hands in her lap, fingers working through the motion of something rehearsed. "We can't name it," she said, looking straight at Julia for the first time since the question. "But we have to promise you we're keeping the silence together, like we always have." The sting in her voice softened as she leaned forward, pushing a plate of untouched salad toward Julia. "Eat something. You're not the only one who can't sleep tonight." Christian exhaled, shoulders dropping, and the family settled into the uneasy, shared hush of something unspoken, something that insisted on remaining just out of reach. Julia pressed her thumb flat against the envelope flap and nudged it toward the center of the table. Coffee rings, the scorch of the stovetop from earlier, the faint smell of rosemary still clung to the kitchen. Christian reached out with both palms but didn't swat or snatch. He merely hovered, like a warning light, waiting for permission. "We told ourselves it was to keep you safe," Elise said, stepping from the hallway with a dish towel clenched in one hand. Her shoulders stayed square down the corridor, but relaxed a fraction once she reached the island. "You deserved better than silence, and I know it now." She set the towel down, smoothing the granite twice before folding it. "I was wrong to put that night in a locked box without telling you why." Julia slid the envelope toward Elise as if the paper trail might become heavier with truth. "Then tell us something. Anything. Isn't that part of being a family?" Her voice clipped. Her foot knocked a chair, clattering it against the tile. Elise looked at Christian, who hadn't moved. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and that small motion released just enough of the air around them. "I'm not saying nothing happened," Elise said, eyes tracing the edge of the letter. "I'm saying the mistake, what I did, hurt us. Hurt you. Hurt those faces in this kitchen. It wasn't just about silence. It was about me trying to survive guilt by burying it. I stopped listening when you needed me to explain. That was the mistake." She didn't move closer. Her words hung like breath in cold air. "So the gap wasn't about protecting us," Christian muttered, voice low enough that Julia leaned forward. "It was about protecting you from yourself. We were told the silence was for our good," Oliver said from the doorway, having been upstairs until now. He stood with his back against the frame. "Now we can see the silence was also hiding something that hurt you. But it still doesn't say what happened." His fingers twisted the edge of the frame, nails scoring faint lines into the paint. Elise touched the envelope with the pad of her thumb, then pulled her hand away. "I'm saying I can't give you the whole story tonight." Her throat worked once. "I know that's hurtful, but I'm telling you I was wrong, and I'm going to stop pretending otherwise." Julia exhaled raggedly and let her shoulders drop by a hair, the way someone lets go of a rope they've been gripping too tightly. "That's something. It's not everything, but it's the first crack." Christian sat on the edge of the chair, braced, and let out a breath. "We'll open this when you're ready to sit with it all again," he said, nodding toward Elise, the envelope between them. "We'll do it together." Elise didn't look at the paper, but at the children, a flicker of determination lining her mouth. "I'm not asking you to forget the silence," she said finally. "I'm asking you to hear me say that the silence was my error. I'll keep telling you as much as I can without dragging you through it before we're ready." Julia lifted her chin and met her mother's eyes. The envelope lay between them like a dare. But now, instead of a wall, it felt like a door that might swing open if they stood there long enough. The smell of rosemary faded as the house exhaled. Once Elise moved from the table, Julia picked up the envelope again, fingers now gentle. She didn't open it yet, but she didn't push it away either. Christian put his hand on the back of her chair, hardly touching, a silent promise to stay beside her while she waited. By the time Elise rinsed the towel and started stacking dishes, Julia and Oliver exchanged a look, a shared awareness that the story had shifted, that the version of their parents acting with total transparency was gone. But the acknowledgement that they had been hurt suddenly stood where silence had been before. A raw light that promised more, but also warned them not to rush the next part. Julia plants her elbows on the scarred kitchen table and doesn't let the silence grow again. "Ms. Henriksen says I have to say it exact," she tells Elise, her voice threaded with the same control she uses for homework. "I told her about the man behind the shed, and that you told me to say I fell in the woods." Christian's shoulders twitch. He is halfway between doorway and table before he catches himself. "Keep this inside," he starts. But Julia doesn't look at him. She looks straight at Elise. The envelope is open beside her, the word "remember" still crisp. The small photograph tucked inside, glaring up like an accusation. "I don't remember falling," Julia insists. She drags a thumbnail over the picture until the paper curls. "I remember heat and a whisper, and your hand on my mouth when I screamed. I remember you saying, 'Not even a whisper. We keep it like it never happened.'" Her jaw tightens. "I told Ms. Henriksen that because I can't keep pretending I don't feel it." Elise's fingers find the edge of the table. The heat from Julia's hand seems to chase the color down her own arm. She swallows and lets air out in a long, trembling breath. "You were wrong," she says too quickly. "I told you that because I was afraid." Her thumb clears the condensation ring left by Christian's coffee. "Afraid that if we said it, the man would come back, afraid you'd see me fall apart. I made a promise to stay quiet. Not to you, to me. I lied." Christian's jaw clenches. His palm hits the wood. "Afraid of what? You made a promise to protect her, not to keep this from her." But he doesn't step toward Elise. He lets the word hang, watching the tightness in Julia's face loosen just a hair. Julia folds her arms around herself. "That's the memory," she says. "Not the quiet." She looks between them. I'm not keeping it quiet anymore. Elise reaches for the envelope and closes it with a movement that says she is still learning how to close anything with gentleness. She doesn't pull away when Julia leans toward her and rests her head against Elise's knee. Christian moves to the sink, but not to leave. He rinses his hands under the tap and then just stands there, the water running over his fingers like a small, merciless truth. "We'll answer the counselor's questions together," Elise murmurs, voice rough. No more promises to silence her. Julia lets out a breath that sounds like a laugh and a sob at once. Trust is fraying. She sees that in the way Christian's shoulders still can't relax. But she also sees that the fraying is already letting light through. The man behind the shed is out of the silence now, And the next step is to name what happened without hiding behind the pact. Julia drags the folding table into the garage, dragging open the cabinet where the shoeboxes live. Elise follows, breath coming quick enough that it rattles. Christian trails, the echo of his footsteps loud over the hum of the heater. Julia dumps photographs, babysitter notes, and an old bullet point journal across the table. "We get it all on paper," she says, and the kids lean over, lips pressed tight. She tapes a calendar page to the plywood, the night circled in red. What happened here? What was told? What actually happened? Write it down. No sidestepping. Elise uncaps a marker, hesitates, then adds a thin line of ink. "We stayed inside. No sign of man." Christian grabs a different color and marks a bar next to it. "Garden. Door unlocked. I dragged her back from the shed." Julia adds another. "Shelter. Lie told to Julia. Game of hide and seek." Gabe, who has been sitting on the steps, unfolds a note he found under the couch cushion last week. He lays it beside the calendar. "Promise, we stop talking when she asks." His voice wobbles. He doesn't look at Elise. "Why didn't this stay small?" Elise asks. But instead of defense, she rubs her thumb against the ink, as if smoothing away something that will not fade. Julia pulls up an audio file on her phone. The counselor taped a portion with permission. The clip plays a single cut of Elise saying, "You keep your mouth shut or I'll tell everyone you started it." The tension spikes. Christian snaps the phone shut. He looks at Elise, then at the scattered papers, then back at Julia. "I wanted to protect her," Christian says, and the anger in his throat sharpens. "But we let it become a code we couldn't break." He slides a hand over the calendar and traces every inked note, forcing his gaze to meet Elise's. "You told her to lie. I agreed out of fear." He stops, clenches his jaw, and lets out air. Elise nods once. "Yes," she whispers, then looks toward Gabe and his sister. "We all agreed to protect a moment that should have been investigated." Her shoulders drop a fraction. Julia flips through one more photograph. A blurry snapshot of the backyard, late dusk, Christian's car in the background. On the back, Christian had once scribbled, "Stayed with her." She points. "When you wrote this, we'd already made the pact. That's why Dad feels guilty even now." Gabe adds, "The lies were for you, not us." The kids exchange a look, and for a second, the air clears. They haven't been shielded, but used. Elise steps toward the doorway and pauses. "I don't know how to undo this," she says, "but I can stop covering it." She reaches down and places her hand on the calendar, fingertips resting on those inked lines. "We can make sure the stories we tell each other match what happened." The others gather, not in agreement, but in a shared, unbearable clarity. A siren wails outside, distant, like a reminder that outside the garage the world keeps moving. In the stale air, the family doesn't speak. They keep writing, crossing, and for the first time, facing the deliberate gaps in their history. The illusion of a united front lay in pieces on the plywood, each line a crack letting in light. Julia drags the folding table back into the living room, lining it under the window where the light slips through the cracked curtain. The timeline board leans on the wall, sticky notes rearranged into a jagged path. Christian dumps 2 fresh packs of markers and a stack of lined paper on the tabletop, clattering them like a challenge. Elise stands in the doorway, with her palms flat against her ribs, breathing fast, still raw from swallowing silence for years. Julia snaps a red marker cap and slams it down on the table. "We start here," she says, pushing the small handwritten card with the words, "Night of April 12, into the middle of the board. Her fingers tremble but don't let go. She pulls another note from the drawer, places it beside the first, and writes in bold letters, "Elise spoke first." I was wrong. She pins the card with both thumbs and finally looks up. Now we put the rest on the board where everyone can see it. Every detail that was hidden. Everything we promised never to say. Elise steps forward. I'll say it again. Her voice shakes, but she leans over the table, takes the blue marker from Christian's offered hand, and writes, I lied about the man behind the shed. I lied to Julia to keep the silence. I chose my fear over my daughter. Her looped letters wobble, but she doesn't stop. The marker squeaks as she writes her name at the bottom of the card with a steady stroke. The room stays silent except for the squeal and the hum of the refrigerator. Christian exhales, almost a laugh and a sob tangled together. He reaches for the final card and scribbles, I kept the lie to protect Elise. I kept silent to keep the house whole. I see now how I helped break us. Julia picks up the envelope labeled, Remember, and cracks it open again. Inside, a single page, ink smudged from tears. She slides it onto the table, smoothing it with both hands. She doesn't read aloud this time. She lets it lie there, open, for everyone to see. The kids move in, cluster around the table, lean their bodies on the edge as if that's where the truth is nailed down. Elise crouches and cups the youngest's face. We will write letters together, she whispers. She pulls out a fresh sheet, tears it in half, and hands one to Julia. You write your version of what you remember. I write mine. We read them out loud to each other in front of everyone. No more guarding alone. Julia takes the paper, sets her jaw, and nods, then scribbles the first line. Her pen scratches rapidly, breaking the air between them. Christian grabs the third sheet and scribbles, I will answer questions honestly. No more shielding. He places the letter back on the table and slides it toward Julia. You keep telling me when I start to slip, he says. If I shut down, pull me back in. Elise nods, wipes her thumb across her lips, and then drags Julia into a sudden, tight hug. Julia freezes, fingers pressed against Elise's shoulder, then folds in. Christian watches them, then reaches out to put a hand on Elise's back. It's quiet when they release, but the air hums differently. Charged. Ready. The youngest tugs Elise's shirt and points to the timeline, eyes wide. We can draw the future now? They ask. Elise bends, pulls the marker toward them, and for the first time the board is not just a record of pain. It's a place they can draw trust together. They start writing new promises on the blank space beneath the notes. Weekly check-ins, shared rooms for honesty, no topic off limits when someone says it's time. Each line is a small release, a visible payoff. They tape the papers down, sealing the promise. The room is messier than before. Papers, markers, tears. And it rings with the sound of new trust in action. We go to the counselor together tomorrow, Julia says, picking up the timeline card with the sticky date. We go with everything on the table. We let someone else witness too. Elise nods, and Christian gives a short laugh that doesn't shake. The truth is audible now, and they move forward with it. The timeline lay across the coffee table, sticky notes radiating out from the center like ripples. Julia dragged a chair in, the scraped legs squealing on the hardwood, and held up the stack of new entries she had written the night before. I want this read out loud so everyone hears it the same way, she said, flipping to the page titled, When Silence Became Armor. Christian set down his mug with a clack and opened his own notebook. Elise, already seated, rubbed her thumb along the edge of a sticky note that said, Ask before anything else. Julia took a breath and said, I'm not letting that night stay blurred anymore. I remember the shove, the man behind the shed, the way you told me to stay quiet. She didn't plead, She simply looked from Elise's hands to Christian's fists, still unclenched, but tight. Christian nodded once, a short exhale escaping him, and said, "I kept the silence because you asked, Elise. That doesn't stop me from hearing Julia now." His voice wavered when he added, "I want to know the boundary you need when we talk about this." Elise slammed her palm over the sticky note, her signal that she'd been listening but needed space to respond. "The boundary is consent," she said, eyes level with Julia's. "No more pressuring, no more carved-out pauses without everyone agreeing. If I'm triggered, I tap here." She tapped the timeline. "And we stop. We can't go back to pretending the silence was easy." The peak came when Julia laid her written response on the table. The ink smudged where her fingers trembled. "I forgave you," she said in a tone that kept steady, but broke at the end. "But that forgiveness belongs on paper only if there is honesty moving forward. I need you to say it out loud when you realize you're covering again." Elise lifted her shoulders, took a breath as if through a straw, and released it slowly before replying, "I hear you. I'll stop myself before the lie leaves my mouth." Christian leaned forward, pushing the timeline toward them, and added, "And I'll point it out the moment I feel the old rhythm starting, not to shame, but to keep us honest." Clara, who had been quiet, slid a new sticky note under the gentle boundaries section. "Weekly check-ins now include what we keep said aloud, so we don't let silence swallow it." The room exhaled together, the tension easing into a brittle but solid calm, the payoff being the shared knowledge that they were no longer the same people, watching silence hold them hostage. The living room hummed with the silent weight of the newly hung timeline, a ribbon of paper curling over the mantel with inked refusals and confessions. The promise tap etched by Elise's fingertips before any fresh wound was opened. Julia held the newest page where the remembered night sat uncloaked. And Christian, still clenched, now simply breathed with the readiness to break in if the old quiet crept back, a hand hovering above the couch as if over a sleeping child. Elise touched the boundary mark, her eyes wet. And then she lifted her gaze to meet each sibling and father in turn, the pact of silence dissolved in the glow of what was now known. The children leaned close, listening as the truth rode Julia's voice. The man behind the shed named again. The terrible instructions recalled without shame, and every hidden corner of the past poured out. Not to heal, but to make them all utterly responsible for the remainder of their days. The counselor's chair stayed empty, replaced by their bodies pressed into the room. The last lie aired, and the last promise kept. The house would never forget that night now, never shield itself with softness, and the shared history settled like a new, unreturning horizon across their faces.